Hello everybody and welcome to Grey History, episode 83, The Trial of the Girondins Part 2. In the last episode, we saw an ever-expanding conspiracy. From the 2nd of June to the 3rd of October, the number of deputies proscribed in some form literally quadrupled. With formal accusations against 45 traitors, their trial would now commence. Yet, before we get into it, let me commence this episode with a tremendous thank you to the Grey History community. Bringing you this podcast is no easy task, and the only reason why I'm able to do so is because of the generosity of people all over the world. 2025 will be the make or break year for the podcast, and I can't stress enough that I could really use your support to bring you more history that isn't black and white. There's plenty of perks that come with supporting the show, and by donating a coffee or two a month, you can do your part to keep Grey History on the air. There's a 7-day free trial and new monthly and annual memberships, so there are plenty of options to suit your generosity style. In short, please support the show today, and I look forward to welcoming you personally. Now, it's with tremendous pleasure that I get to welcome the newest members of the Grey History community. A warm welcome to the newest virtuous citizens, William, Kunla, and Melissa M. Another warm welcome to the newest true revolutionaries, Rohan, Lexi, and Melissa E. Of course, with a revolution in danger, the people need champions. A huge welcome to Matthew, who joins the Champions of the People, Cindy, George, William, Laura, Daniel, Monica, Joel, Adam, Tom, Eyal, Harold, David, Alistair, Jeff, Ritus, Cameron, Britt, Dan, Paul, Deborah, Susan, Danny, and Gordon. Lastly, one final thank you to the great of the greats, the stars of the Republic, the heroes of the Revolution, Brian, Charles, Jeff, Olga, Kevin R., Scott, Howard, Hilberto, Ron, Kevin S., and Fernando. As always, thank you so much to every member of the community, as you are what makes this all possible. Anyway, that's enough from me, so let's get into it. The conciergerie. It sounds fancy, doesn't it? If you were in Paris and someone said, "We're staying at the conciergerie," you might think to yourself that they're travelling in style. Deriving from the word concierge, the conciergerie has a hint of luxury, service, grandeur. Surely it's the residence of the creme de la creme. Well, yes, but not voluntarily. Although a museum in our own times, the conciergerie was once a critical prison in central Paris. Built on the western side of the Ile de la Cité, the building is part of the broader palace which shares the island's name. Located in the middle of the Seine River and Paris itself, it's the Ile de la Cité which holds the famous Notre Dame. But, long before the establishment of either palace or cathedral, the island of the city had housed power for centuries. Even in Gallo-Roman times, the Ile de la Cité had both a fort and a temple. After the fall of Rome, Clovis, the first king of the Franks, used the island to establish his capital in Paris. From here, the royal presence grew. Over several centuries, the palace became a vast and sprawling compound, eventually titled the Palais de la Cité, or Palace of the City. With time, kings decamped the island, but the palace continued to contain the royal archives, the treasury, and a host of judicial and administrative institutions. Of these, the most important was the Paris Parlement. Although it's been some time since we've discussed the Parlements, these historic courts would later play key roles in obstructing the agenda of Louis XVI. However, back in the 14th century, it was decided that the realm's most important court needed a new addition: a prison. As such, a royal official, a concierge, was given the task of creating and administering an ever larger prison underneath the Palace of Justice. The caretaker succeeded in this endeavour, and the prison soon inherited a new name: the Conciergerie. While not the most famous prison in French history, the Conciergerie is a contestant for second place. If the Bastille is infamous for mysterious prisoners and horrific torture, the Conciergerie is renowned for realities rather than mere myths. From regicides to traitors, heretics to murderers, many of the nation's most controversial criminals spent time at the Conciergerie. Adjacent to the kingdom's highest court, the sentences were severe. Execution was not uncommon. When the Revolution broke out in 1789, the institutions of Ile-de-la-Cité were, of course, reformed. The Paris Parlement was abolished, and jails were soon overhauled. Yet, despite new courts and a new means of execution, the Conciergerie remained a fully functioning prison. When the Revolutionary Tribunal needed a new home in March 1793, the Palace of Justice, the former halls of the Parlement, seemed like a natural fit. Perhaps it was a poor omen that directly underneath lay the Conciergerie, the site of some of the most brutal killings in the September massacres just months prior. 6 months later, in October 1793, the complex of the former palace was a busy place. With terror the de facto policy of the revolutionary government, the number of prisoners and trials was increasing substantially. Remember, the law of suspects of September saw the number of Parisian prisoners triple in the final months of the year. Likewise, reforms to the Revolutionary Tribunal saw a similar increase in the number of executions. But this rising activity does not include the fanfare and madness of political show trials. These commenced in mid-October with the trial of the former Queen. Referred to the tribunal earlier that month, the trial of Marie Antoinette lasted just 2 days. Guillotined for treason, the Girondins were next in line. With 45 deputies formally accused by the convention, proceedings commenced on the 24th of October. But in order to explore the trial of the Girondins, we first need to tackle the obvious misnomer. While discussions of these events implies the trial of all the Girondins, in reality it was only a minority of the 45 deputies who were actually put on trial. Thus, before we can continue, we need to unpack who precisely was being tried. Unfortunately for the government, not every defendant could make the date. Since June, much of the Girondin leadership had fled Paris, and of those who did, their initial escapes had proved deceivingly successful. For a brief moment, France was in uproar. Dozens of departments protested their expulsion, and many talked of armed insurrection against Parisian anarchy. Yet, with the Federalist revolts collapsing around the country, so too did the freedoms of renegade deputies. Several remained on the run for months, and others even outlasted the terror. But most of the prominent Girondins eventually ran out of luck, some sooner than later. Critically, Brosseau was one of the first to be captured, caught just a week after he had fled the capital. As most fugitives were not this unlucky, many of the convention's traitors were still on the loose come the 24th of October. This included the former mayor Pétion, the former minister Rollin, and many of the leading instigators of the Federalist revolts. Consequently, despite these events being called the trial of the Girondins, the majority of the 45 deputies formally accused by the convention were actually missing their trial. However, despite only 21 deputies being brought before the court, the convention had trapped several notables. Of those present, many of the most famous Girondins could still be found. Brissot, the figurehead, Vergniaud, the orator, Carrat, the journalist, Jossenet, the champion of revolutionary war. While Big Fish had escaped the net, this was still a consequential haul. Joining them were many deputies proscribed after the 2nd of June, meaning that they had not had the chance to flee the capital like those originally placed under house arrest. Indeed, a majority of the 21 defendants had been detained after the insurrection of 2 June, and almost half had been free men just weeks before. Remember, it was only on the 3rd of October that the Committee of General Security doubled the list of formal traitors, accusing several deputies who were still sitting in the convention. Furthermore, of those recently charged, keep in mind that historian Marisa Linton notes that several had rejected the Federalist rebellions and were only marginally associated with the Girondins' inner network. So, with the 21 defendants actually put on trial, one finds a motley crew. Some were Girondin leaders, others had only loose ties to that leadership, and virtually none had been major players in the Federalist revolts. Those deputies remained on the run. Thus, even though these events are called the trial of the Girondins, we're actually missing a substantial number of influential figures. Adding to the misnomer, this eclectic mix of defendants was joined by the Montagnard deputy Sillery. Ironically, Sillery was only arrested in April because of Girondin attacks. However, unlike the former Duc d'Orléans, Sillery would not be granted a separate trial, meaning that this aristocratic Jacobin would die alongside his accusers. Given that he does have his own separate trial, the fate of Philippe Égalité will be covered in the next episode, the death of yesterday's heroes. But before we move on, I appreciate that tracking which Girondins were free and who was in the dock is not the easiest of tasks. Furthermore, I imagine that for those on the run, you're probably interested in how their story ends. Newsflash, generally not well. Few have the pleasure of dying in their beds, and some are even guillotined despite already being dead. So, in the episode extra for this episode, we will be doing a detailed breakdown of how various proscription lists changed over time, and how fugitive deputies eventually lost their lives. Essentially, it's a run-through of how we arrived at the 45 traitors, and the story of those lucky enough to avoid the trial of their peers, only to die another way. Of course, some Girondins do make it through the entirety of the Terror, and so we'll also cover their stories as well. Finally, this episode extra will be done in both video and audio formats, so if you want to put a face to the name, don't forget that option. Of course, if you're not a member of the show, I could really use your help to keep this podcast off the scaffold. There's a 7-day free trial, and you can cancel anytime. So why not binge the ad-free bonus content and help make history that isn't oversimplified? Just follow the links in the show notes on the website or Google Grey History Patreon. In fact, if you do it during this ad break, you'll never have to hear ads again. So, on the 24th of October, proceedings began against 21 deputies. Having already covered the trial of Marie Antoinette, the process will look familiar. If one were to take their eyes off the defendants, one would see Jacobins. Judges, jurors, prosecutors, witnesses, all committed Jacobins. Lest anyone think that this was going to be a fair trial, multiple historians note how witnesses became prosecutors themselves. Considering that Jacques Hébert was amongst the witnesses called, perhaps this isn't surprising. Now, broadly speaking, the accusations against the Girondins can be bucketed into two distinct categories. Firstly, those that were based on factual realities, and secondly, those that weren't. To be clear, this is of course not how contemporaries thought of them. The Girondins considered themselves completely innocent, while their Montagnard accusers less so. But for our purposes, there is merit in looking at what allegations were objectively factual and what required a more active imagination. From there, you can decide which of these offences were worthy of execution. Let's start with the crimes that actually did occur. The most damning of these was the Girondin orchestration of the Federalist revolts. Grouped with the assassination of Marat and the defection of Toulon, these departmental rebellions had betrayed the nation at a time of existential crises. The latest and potentially greatest of all their alleged conspiracies, the Federalist revolts were a factual reality, as was Girondin encouragement. Yet there was just one problem. As I said earlier, of the 45 traitors formally accused by the convention, only 21 were now defendants before the Revolutionary Tribunal. Most of these had been proscribed after the 2nd of June, and a significant minority hadn't been arrested until the 3rd of October. By then, the Federalist revolts of the North and Marseille had completely collapsed, and the siege of Lyon was just days away from ending. Needless to say, it wasn't these deputies who had fled Paris and raised the standard of rebellion. Instead, the Girondins actually guilty of insurrection were still on the run. Of the 9 traitors originally proposed by Saint-Just at the start of July, none were before the court. Furthermore, little evidence tied the detained Girondins to the provincial rebellions, as many had actively rebuked them. In short, the most obvious and egregious of the Girondin conspiracies applied to other Girondins. The defendants in Paris were neither leaders nor participants in the Federalist revolts. However, if the Federalist revolts were not the easiest charge to stick, what next? Well, it brings me some measure of joy to tell you that we do actually have a genuine Girondin conspiracy. All the way back in episode 32, Uninvited Guests, we witnessed the expulsion of the so-called Bressoan ministry. In June 1792, the Interior Minister Roland read a scandalous letter to King Louis XVI. The king's obstruction was crippling the nation, aiding the enemy, endangering the French throne. Told to choose between the old ways and the new, Louis responded by firing the Girondin ministers. A week later, on the 20th of June, a crowd of sans-culottes burst into the Tuileries Palace. Demanding the reinstatement of the Bressoans, the people cornered the king and made him toast to the health of the nation. Now, this invasion of the Tuileries outraged constitutional monarchists, but it also disgusted the Gironde. With the popular movement radicalising beyond their control, some deputies of the then Legislative Assembly sought a truce with the throne. Foreseeing the monarchy's impending collapse, they secretly advised the king. recommending drastic actions to save his crown, their advice was actually pretty sound. Rebuke the émigrés, support the war, install a new popular ministry. Obviously, their efforts proved unsuccessful, yet that's beside the point. What matters is that 3 deputies, Girondin, Girondin, and most importantly Vernieu, had entered into secret correspondence with the court. Historians debate as to whether these actions are justifiable, but regardless, this was a real, authentic, genuine Girondin plot, one designed to save the monarchy. The fact that the king ultimately ignored this reasonable and patriotic advice is, frankly, irrelevant. What matters is that by the time Vernieu and Girondin sat before the Revolutionary Tribunal, their secret counter-revolutionary acts were clear for all to see. However, here again we reach another issue. Thanks to incriminating letters, 2 deputies were compromised, but the trial had 21 defendants. As such, these scandalous dealings only applied to a fraction of the accused. Thus, the Jacobin prosecution found themselves in a similar situation to their allegations of Federalist insurrection. Yes, conspiracy was a factual reality. Yes, debatably, treason had occurred. Yet the authors of these crimes were either missing from the trial or consisted of only a small portion of the defendants. Finally, when discussing accusations grounded in reality, we can't ignore the very public efforts to save the monarchy. In addition to conspiracies behind closed doors, the votes of the Girondins showed further proof of counter-revolution. Viewed from an unfavourable perspective, the Girondins had spent much of 1792 defending Louis XVI. Obviously, one needs to selectively ignore the first 6 months when they relentlessly assaulted his government and focus merely on the second half. Here, one finds plenty of ammunition. Firstly, on the 10th of August, the Girondins of the Legislative Assembly had suspended rather than dethroned the king. Secondly, the Girondins of the Convention were then accused of delaying his trial before demanding the appeal to the people in late December. Lastly, with the referendum to determine Louis's fate ultimately defeated, the Girondins made a final effort to save his life, voting for some form of clemency. Yet, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, here again we hit problems. As discussed during the trial of the king, the votes of the Girondins were anything but unanimous. In fact, they provide key evidence for why some argue that we shouldn't think of these deputies as a coherent faction. While many supported the appeal to the people, others vigorously opposed it. Likewise, when some advanced exile or a stay of execution, there were those who demanded immediate death. Historian Michael Sydenham, an expert on the Girondins, identifies 16 deputies he deemed to be the closest to Brissot. Of those in this inner network, almost 20% voted against the appeal to the people, while 30% supported the king's execution. Critically, a full 50% voted against reprieve after the convention had pronounced in favour of death. To be clear, this disunity is found in Brissot's innermost circle. Thus, while accusations of saving the monarchy were easily stuck to certain deputies, many prominent defendants could highlight their less than royalist record. This includes Vernieu, who, despite his secret letters, voted loudly in favour of death. It also includes the journalist Carrard, whose monumental mistakes we'll discuss momentarily. Thus, whether it be the Federalist revolts, secret collusion, or very public actions, for every accusation grounded in factual reality, those same realities offered as much evidence for individual innocence as they did for collective guilt. But it's here that we move from the factual to the factional. As foreshadowed with en-masse report to the convention on the 3rd of October, the Jacobins used a range of techniques to incriminate every defendant. Actions were taken out of context to create the appearance of guilt, and every Girondin was deemed collectively responsible for any individual act. With every word, every vote, every deed a planned part of an elaborate conspiracy, the crimes of one were suddenly the crimes of all. Moreover, the trial had also adopted B.U. Varennes' advice that the absence of hard proof be ignored. Satisfied with the knowledge that any good conspiracy would leave no definitive evidence, fragments of letters and misconstrued actions became the proof that was previously missing. From here, well, one could prove pretty much anything. Now, to provide some examples of how the actions of one could incriminate all, let's look at one of the more outlandish accusations. During the convention, Jean-Louis Carrat voted against the appeal to the people and in favour of the king's execution. But back in July 1792, Carrat was a prominent journalist and a vocal member of the Jacobin Club. An advocate for revolutionary war and a firm member of the Bressoan clique, Carrat can claim ownership of one of the dumbest ideas in revolutionary history. In late July, Carrat suggested that if Louis XVI attempted to flee the country again, the French could replace their monarch with a foreign prince. Specifically, Carrat suggested the Prussian Duke of Brunswick. Despite leading the Prussian armies, according to Carrat, Brunswick was not the enemy, but rather the restorer of European liberty. Apparently, if he came to Paris, the Duke's first move would be to go to the Jacobins and put on the bonnet rouge. However, just days later, the Duke released the infamous Brunswick Manifesto. You know, the one which threatened Paris with unprecedented vengeance if the slightest harm came to their majesties. Needless to say, this wasn't a great look for Carrat, who proceeded to backpedal immediately. But to digress for a moment, if you're thinking to yourself that that was a humongous blunder, it actually was bigger than it first appears. Alongside the Prussian general, Carrat suggested another alternative, the English Duke of York. Now, in July 1792, the French were at least not at war with the English, but by the time of Carrat's trial in October 1793, this proposal was equally impolitic. The Duke of York had led the English in the Low Countries and had besieged Dunkirk just months prior. So Carrat managed to suggest two foreign generals who both led their respective forces in subsequent invasions of France. Now, this ridiculous proposal was only ever voiced by one Girondin deputy. In fact, he wasn't even a deputy at the time, he was just a journalist. But the actions of one were now the actions of all, and so here was proof that every Girondin was complicit in royalist conspiracy. Amongst the various accusations against the accused, it was alleged that the entire faction had attempted to install foreign princes on the French throne. Yet, as fanciful as this accusation was, this is just one example. The trial lasted for 7 days, allowing plenty of creative allegations. Another example of how the actions of a few could incriminate every defendant can be found in the case of de Maurier. Prior to his treason, de Maurier had once been France's foreign minister, serving alongside the so-called Bressoan ministers until June 1792. After their dismissal, de Maurier returned to the army, becoming the saviour of the Republic by halting the Prussian advance at Valmy. Yet, despite conquering Belgium just months later, by October 1793, de Maurier was a national villain, now the traitor of the Republic, whose failed coup had incriminated his Girondin supporters, most notably Brissot and the former Interior Minister Roland. According to the prosecution, the Girondins had conspired with de Maurier to reinstall the monarchy, this time the king's cousin, the former Duc d'Orléans. Furthermore, de Maurier had deliberately let the Prussians retreat from France, aided by the journalist Carrat and the Montagnard deputy Sillery. With further proof of Girondin plots to aid foreign and royalist interests, inconvenient truths were of course ignored. In reality, only a subset of the Girondin network had any connections with the general, and many Montagnards had once been equally vocal in support. Remember, Danton was himself in hot water for his connections to de Maurier, and he was by no means the only Jacobin who once promoted his cause. So here again, through selective interpretations and questionable evidence, one could implicate every defendant for a conspiracy in which they played no part. Now, the case of de Maurier offers a convenient segue to broader themes of the trial. Seeking to demonstrate the sinister nature of the Girondin cabal, a great deal of attention was paid to their personal ambition. To understand the gravity of this, we must take a step back and unpack a key component of the revolution's political culture. Since the beginning of the revolutionary era, the deputies of the National Assembly idolised men of virtue. Legislators were expected to be selfless, champions of the public good, no matter the personal cost. Modesty, transparency, authenticity, these were the behaviours expected of one dedicated to the people's interests. In such a climate, politics became incredibly moralistic. While we might expect our politicians to be ambitious and at times deceitful, the expectation of deputies was the polar opposite. Any sense of corruption, vanity, duplicity, hypocrisy, hedonism was not just impolitic, it reeked of the old regime. Such behaviour, such self-interest, was a danger to the nation. Indeed, legislators who weren't virtuous were corrupting the Republic, endangering equality, liberty, and even the security of the state. In this era which prized selflessness, any misuse of public office was seen as unforgivably egregious. It's for this reason that deputies of all stripes spent considerable efforts cultivating virtuous personas. Likewise, it's for the same reason that the Jacobin prosecution sought to besmirch the reputation of the accused. Of particular note was their alleged lust for power. According to witness testimony, much of the Girondins' desire to save the monarchy was actually born from personal ambition. Seeking to install themselves in ministerial posts, they also sought the elevation of countless political allies. In fact, witnesses accused the defendants of secret meetings in which Brissot and others granted offices to an array of obedient puppets. With everyone benefiting from prestige and position, the corruption of the Gironde was evidently insatiable. Assisting this portrayal was a fondness to gather in salons. In an age which valued transparency, the closed-door dealings of the Girondins were inherently suspicious. Although gathering in a variety of settings, the most famous salon was Madame Roland's. For that, the wife of the former Interior Minister would be brought to trial in November, a topic for the next episode. For now, what's critical to note is that these Girondin meetings were sheltered from public scrutiny. Consequently, it was all too easy to tie them to vice and crime. Corruption, duplicity, counter-revolution, why else was such secrecy required? While the virtuous Jacobins debated in broad daylight, the Girondins conspired in the dark. Thus, for all the Girondin claims to represent the people, the Jacobins could prove otherwise. Their ambition, their secrecy, their corruption had distracted and divided the nation, and at a time of existential struggle. This was not just immoral, it was conspiratorial. It was treason. Now, to be fair, you and I might not see corruption so much as the elevation of like-minded associates. Every few years, the entire US political system seems to grind to a halt as the president-elect nominates thousands of political appointees. Nowadays, this process happens behind closed doors. So too do many meetings with senators which must approve key appointees. But while we can debate the qualifications of specific nominees, few would argue that these individuals were anything but staunch political allies of the incoming administration. In short, we expect our politicians to reward associates. We expect them to surround themselves with like-minded individuals who will work together to achieve a common aim. Furthermore, we expect our politicians to be ambitious. We might not like it, we might want to change it, but it's the behaviour we expect. Yet, the French Revolution was different. It was quite literally inventing modern politics. And back then, with the republics of antiquity acting as lessons, any form of favouritism or careerism was seen as corruption and self-interest. This was not only immoral, but a threat to the foundations of the state. It was not part of the system. It was a danger to the system. Of course, ideology clashed with reality. The Montagnards themselves also installed men who they deemed to be reliable patriots, but that was conveniently overlooked. Well, until they denounced each other for vice, corruption and conspiracy, but hey, those are trials for 1794. The point is that the secret dealings of the Girondins, their elevation of allies, their concerted effort to install ministers and officials not only allowed the betrayal of an elaborate, secret and sinister plot, but it also enabled the destruction of their virtuous reputations. These corrupt deputies had betrayed the people's trust. Moreover, in their hunger for prestige and power, they had betrayed the national interest. In a time of existential struggle, this was treason, and it would be punished as such. Taken all together, the prosecution had the ingredients for a conviction. Or at least, I think they did. As neither a lawyer nor a chef, take this with a pinch of salt. 0.5 grams. I like precise recipes. Looking back at what we've just discussed, we can see intent, motive, means, and evidence. The intent was to support monarchy, either the original or a reinstated version. The motive was personal ambition. Lusting for power, the Girondins would be the masters of a puppet king, enriching themselves and betraying the unfortunate nation. The means was all too obvious. Despite the privacy of the salons, it was clear that these secret meetings were the occasions in which the defendants formed their sinister plots. Carefully installing ministers, generals, and all sorts of office holders, the accused had infiltrated the entire government as they advanced their selfish cause. Finally, there was the irrefutable evidence: the Federalist revolts, the secret letters to the king, the very public attempts to promote royalty, firstly by trying to save Louis's life, and then by supporting both French and foreign princes. These claims had their origins in actual events, and then there were the accusations with questionable or non-existent evidence. Remember, Aymar had accused the Girondins of allying with British Prime Minister Pitt. The proof was that he would be pleased by France's recent turmoil. Likewise, one witness even asserted that the Girondins had planned the September massacres, a ploy to discredit the virtuous Jacobins. Presented to a court which had no intention of being fair, this was enough to convict. To top it off, one defendant went rogue. Proclaiming himself to be a firm Montagnard, the deputy Boileau sung the Jacobin hymn sheet. Boileau confessed to conspiracy against the unity and indivisibility of the Republic. Somehow, he couldn't identify its perpetrators, but conspiracy had definitely existed. This weakness may seem surprising, but remember, many of the 21 defendants were not the staunchest of Girondins. Boileau was not connected to the inner network, and he had only been detained on 2 June because he sat on the loathed Commission of 12. Having confessed conspiracy, Boileau planned for clemency, and in this he was wrong. But before we examine the controversial ending to this infamous trial, I would be negligent not to point out the Jacobin perspective. From the comfort of the 21st century, it's easy to roll one's eyes in hindsight. When one hears accusations that the Girondins orchestrated the September massacres, disbelief is an understandable response. Yet the Jacobins really did believe that the Girondins were corrupt and sinister traitors. Consequently, while I have poked holes in the prosecution's arguments, it is worthwhile, just for a moment, to adopt the alternative perspective. From the viewpoint of the Mountain, treason was beyond doubt. The list of crimes was immense, and I'll restrict myself to those grounded in factual reality. Broadly speaking, what the Girondins called moderation, the Jacobins called conspiracy. Since mid-1792, the Gironde had abandoned the people. Initially, Girondin deputies had secretly conspired with the king. Next, they had stifled the toppling of the monarchy before preventing an immediate declaration of dethronement on the 10th of August. Moreover, in the immediate aftermath of the crown's collapse, the Girondins resisted a new revolutionary tribunal. They struggled with the Paris Commune, and in the following month, they used the September massacres to attack the virtuous Jacobins. With the commencement of the Republic, the Girondins then sullied the convention with factional disputes. The opening weeks were marred by attacks on Robespierre and the other incorruptible patriots. By December, these false republicans were rousing pity for Louis XVI, even risking civil war with their appeal to the people. Defeated in this reckless endeavour, the new year commenced with further attempts to avert the king's justified execution. From here, the Gironde expanded the war. Britain, the Netherlands, Spain, these were just some of the latest enemies. With these struggles commencing in setbacks and defeats, was such an expansion incompetence? Or was it treason? Weeks later, the armies were in disarray. The Vendée was in revolt, and worst of all, the man that the Girondins had championed as the saviour of the Republic was attempting a coup d'etat. And yet, even now, Even with the nation in mortal danger, they resisted the extraordinary measures needed to save the country. The Committee of Public Safety, the Revolutionary Tribunal, the surveillance committees. These were opposed or insufficiently empowered by the ever-moderate Gironde. Furthermore, they continued to resist other revolutionary measures, such as price maximums on basic goods and necessities. Instead, they endangered the people by delaying the constitution, protecting greedy merchants, and attempting tyranny and repression. In this, they dragged Marat before the Revolutionary Tribunal, and then they sought the arrest of Hébert and other patriots with their infamous Commission of 12. The people defeated these machinations, but their reply was an inexcusable civil war. Leading the Federalist rebellions, rejecting the Constitution, inspiring assassinations, collaborating with the enemy, executing good Jacobins. One doesn't need to stretch the truth to reach these incriminating conclusions. Indeed, all one needs to do is see these events from a mountaineer's perspective. Gathering in secret meetings, the Girondins had caused it all. While the defendants in the courtroom had not raised the banners of revolt, they had shared the same sentiments, the same benches, the same salons, as the fugitive traitors who had. Collectively, in a grand conspiracy, they had spilt the blood of the French. They had slain their fellow citizens, and they deserved the same fate. So, even if we ignore the most outlandish accusations, it's entirely possible to see undeniable treason. Now, you may agree with the Jacobin perspective, or you may not. But if your sympathies rest with the Girondins, it's important to try to place yourself in the mindset of their accusers. In an era defined by conspiracy, at a time when everyone was gripped by fear of the enemy within, recognizing the alternative perspective is critical to understanding why these events occurred. I am not seeking to justify the trial. Explanations and justifications are two very different things. Instead, what I am highlighting is that to gain what little clarity is possible from these proceedings, I encourage you to contemplate the lived experiences of those whose perspective you disagree with. However, I did tease that this trial would end controversially, and now you'll see why. To dispel any doubt, this was not a fair process. It never had been, it never would be. As historian Marisa Linton notes, the decision to kill the defendants had been taken before the trial had even commenced. As such, while the accused were allowed a legal team, they were given no access to evidence in advance, nor could they call their own witnesses. Despite this, many Girondins were doing a half-decent job at refuting the accusations. Remember, several had been journalists or lawyers, and Vergniaud was not only the best orator of the Gironde, he was perhaps the best speaker of the entire National Convention. Furthermore, none of the deputies who led the Federalist revolts were before the court, and many had only marginal links to the Girondin leadership. As such, although limited in their ability to reply, the defendants were successfully sowing doubt. Where was the evidence of this grand and far-reaching conspiracy? How could one be both Federalist and Royalist simultaneously? Yes, they had championed du Maurier, but so too had the Jacobins and the entire National Convention. By seizing moments to question their accusers, the Girondins were making progress. At times, they reminded the court that although their opinions may be unpopular, liberty granted them the freedom to speak their mind. Furthermore, it was only by taking deeds out of context and ignoring past circumstances that one could portray incriminating plots. Finally, it was not a scheme which bounded them together, but friendship. The Girondins even refuted the idea that they shared a common ideology, let alone a conspiracy. What they had was mutual respect, affinity for fellow men of virtue. By the time the trial reached its 6th day, the patience of the Parisian ultra-radicals was at its limits. These proceedings were intended to prove the guilt of the traitors, yet instead it was undermining it. As such, efforts were made to silence the Gironde. Speaking at the Jacobin Club, the radical Jacques Hébert demanded a swift conclusion to the trial. Using his newspaper to bolster his demands, the convention heard similar requests from the prosecutor Fouquier-Tinville and the judges of the court. With murmurs that the trial had little hard evidence against the accused, and with concerns that proceedings could drag on indefinitely, the Jacobin Club petitioned the convention. In order for terror to remain the order of the day, these monsters must perish. Pushed into action, the convention intervened. Championed by Robespierre himself, a new law was passed which altered the proceedings. Henceforth, it was decreed that all trials could end after 3 days, if, when asked, the jury considered themselves sufficiently enlightened. The next day, October 30, the jury was asked this question. Believe it or not, it desired a continuation of the trial. However, after a long break in the afternoon, the jurors had changed their minds. Unsurprisingly, some historians suggest a quiet word in the intervening hours. Declaring that they had heard enough, the jury would now deliberate. Despite extensive preparations by the accused, the Girondins were denied the opportunity to make a substantial defence. From here, a conviction was returned within hours. Guilty on all charges. Not even Boileau, who had betrayed his peers, would escape the national blade. Reacting with cries of "Long live the Republic" and "We are innocent," the Girondins were defiant to the last. Intent on rejecting this farcical justice, Vallaze revealed a dagger and claimed his own life. Historian Timothy Tackett conveys their final moments the next day. On the following day, October 31, the 20 men still alive were placed in 4 carts and submitted to a passage of infamy, not unlike that of the old regime, a slow drive in a cart from the prison of the Conciergerie up the Seine to the Place de la Révolution. All had read stories of the Romans who bravely went to their deaths, and most were determined to do so themselves. The 2 youngest, Fonfrède and Ducos, were said to have sung patriotic songs. Some, like the men from Bordeaux, had been close friends since well before the Revolution, and according to witnesses, they all embraced one another at the foot of the scaffold. They then lined up, climbed the platform, and faced their death, one after another. Until that day, it was the greatest number ever devoured at one time by the Great Machine. According to a police observer present to record the event, many people began leaving after the 6th execution, with sombre faces and a look of great consternation. When the last head had fallen, there were the inevitable shouts of "Long live the Republic! Long live the nation!" But after that, he wrote, few people spoke to one another. Many of those executed would have been well known and easily identifiable to the crowds. Only recently, they had ranked amongst the most influential and powerful men in France. For many of those present, their demise could only have been sobering, if not terrifying. If the demise of the Girondins was not terrifying for the crowd, it was for their former peers. As November dawned in 1793, justice arrived for yesterday's heroes. Thank you for listening to episode 83, The Trial of the Girondins Part 2. In the next episode, we'll examine the last great show trials of 1793. From a duke to a mayor to even a leading feminist, there's plenty to unpack in the trials of yesterday's heroes. Of course, don't miss the episode extra covering the Girondins who survived these events. Many experienced unfortunate ends, but a few do live long enough to reclaim their seats in the convention. With both video and audio formats, you can enjoy it whichever way you like. Before we wrap up, one final reminder that it would be amazing, fantastic, extraordinarily fabulous if you could support the show. It's not easy making history that's this well researched, and 2025 will be the make or break year for the podcast. So please, if you're enjoying the show and if you'd like to keep enjoying the show, please consider becoming a member of the Grey History community. With ad-free listening, bonus content and a range of other perks, there's plenty to enjoy by doing your part in making history that isn't black and white. Support the show today by following the links in the show notes, on the website, or Google Grey History Patreon. As always, thank you so much to every member of the community, and a special shout out again to the heroes of the revolution: Brian, Charles, Jeff, Auger, Kevin R., Scott, Howard, Hilberto, Ron, Kevin S., and Fernando. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your support. Stay safe and have a great day.